The 1950s weren't just about perfect lawns and white picket fences. They were also about banning fruits that had fed American families for generations. 20 common garden fruits that your great-grandfather grew with pride were quietly removed from seed catalogs, discouraged by agricultural extensions, or outright banned from home gardens. The reasons why will shock you. Number 20. Elderberries. Elderberries were once a staple in American home remedies and jams, but the 1950s brought new concerns about their safety when consumed raw. The bark, leaves, and seeds contain cyanogenic glycosides that can cause nausea and digestive upset, and several cases of children getting sick from eating raw elderberries led to widespread warnings. Agricultural extension offices began discouraging home cultivation, worried about liability if families didn't know proper preparation methods. The irony is that properly cooked elderberries are not only safe, but incredibly nutritious, packed with antioxidants and immune-boosting compounds. But the 1950s culture of safety-first parenting and the rise of processed foods made this traditional fruit seem risky and unnecessary. Most families stopped growing elderberries, and the knowledge of how to use them safely was lost along with the plants themselves. Number 19. Gooseberries. Gooseberries were banned in many states during the 1950s because they served as an alternate host for white pine blister rust, a disease that was devastating America's timber industry. The federal government launched an aggressive eradication campaign, making it illegal to grow, sell, or transport gooseberries and currants in areas where white pines were economically important. Entire orchards were destroyed, and families were forced to remove bushes that had been producing fruit for decades. The ban was so thorough that most Americans forgot gooseberries existed as a food crop. These tart, vitamin C-rich berries had been a backyard staple since colonial times, perfect for pies, jams, and fresh eating. While some states have lifted the ban in recent years, the damage was done. Gooseberries never recovered their place in American gardens, and most people today have never tasted this once common fruit. Number 18. Black currants. Like gooseberries, black currants were banned as part of the white pine blister rust eradication program, but their prohibition was even more complete because they were considered the primary host for the disease. The federal ban lasted from the early 1900s through the 1960s, effectively eliminating black currants from American agriculture and memory. Families who had grown these intensely flavored berries for generations were forced to destroy their bushes or face federal penalties. Black currants were prized for their incredibly high vitamin C content, higher than oranges, and their unique, musky flavor that made exceptional jams and cordials. European immigrants had brought these bushes to America and cultivated them successfully for decades. The ban was so effective that even today, most Americans have never tasted a black currant, despite their popularity in Europe and their recent reintroduction to some U.S. markets. Number 17. Mulberries. Mulberries fell victim to 1950s suburban aesthetics and the war on messy trees. These prolific fruit producers were increasingly seen as nuisances because their sweet berries would drop and stain sidewalks, driveways, and cars. City ordinances began restricting or banning mulberry trees in residential areas, and many existing trees were cut down in the name of neighborhood cleanliness and property values. The fruit itself was never the problem. Mulberries are delicious, nutritious, and were beloved by children who would climb the trees for sweet snacks. But the 1950s emphasis on tidy, controlled landscapes had no room for trees that dropped fruit naturally. Homeowners associations and city planners preferred ornamental trees that looked good but produced nothing edible, marking the beginning of America's shift away from productive landscaping. Number 16. Persimmons. American persimmons were discouraged in home gardens during the 1950s due to widespread confusion about ripeness and edibility. Too many people bit into unripe persimmons and experienced the intensely astringent, mouth-puckering sensation that made the fruit seem inedible. This led to a reputation problem that caused many gardeners to remove their persimmon trees, thinking the fruit was naturally unpalatable. The tragedy is that fully ripe American persimmons are incredibly sweet and flavorful, with a honey-like taste that's completely different from the astringent, unripe fruit. Native Americans and early settlers knew to wait until after the first frost when the fruits became soft and sweet. But as this traditional knowledge faded and people became disconnected from seasonal eating patterns, persimmons gained a reputation as an undesirable fruit that wasn't worth growing. Number 15. Service berries, June berries. Service berries were gradually pushed out of home gardens during the 1950s as they were reclassified from fruit trees to ornamental shrubs. Nurseries began marketing them solely for their spring flowers and fall color, completely ignoring their edible berries that had sustained Native Americans and early settlers for centuries. This shift in marketing meant that most homeowners who planted service berries didn't even know the berries were edible. The berries themselves are delicious, sweet with a hint of almond flavor, perfect for pies, jams, or fresh eating. They're also incredibly nutritious and were once a crucial food source in many regions. But the 1950s focus on ornamental landscaping over productive gardening meant that service berries lost their identity as food plants and became just another pretty shrub that happened to attract birds. Number 14. Pawpaws. Pawpaws, America's largest native fruit, were actively discouraged by agricultural extensions in the 1950s because they didn't fit the commercial agriculture model that was taking over American food production. These tropical-tasting fruits don't ship well, have a short shelf life, and can't be mechanically harvested, all traits that made them unsuitable for the emerging supermarket system. Extension agents steered farmers and gardeners toward crops that could be commercialized. The fruit itself is extraordinary, creamy, custard-like flesh with flavors reminiscent of banana, mango, and vanilla. Native Americans called them the poor man's banana, and they were a favorite food of early settlers. But pawpaws require patience. Trees take 4 to 8 years to fruit, and knowledge. The fruit must be perfectly ripe. Qualities that didn't align with 1950s desires for instant gratification and foolproof crops. Number 13. Beach plums. Beach plums were discouraged from cultivation as coastal development accelerated in the 1950s, and their natural habitat was destroyed for housing developments and beach resorts. These salt-tolerant native plums had been gathered from wild stands for generations, but as coastal areas were developed, the plants disappeared and few people thought to cultivate them in home gardens. Agricultural focus shifted to inland fruit production that could be mechanized and commercialized. Beach plums produce small, intensely flavored fruits that make exceptional jams and jellies with a unique tart sweet taste that can't be replicated by commercial plums. They're perfectly adapted to harsh coastal conditions and require no care once established. But the 1950s development boom eliminated most wild stands, and the knowledge of how to grow and use beach plums was lost along with the habitat. Number 12. Wild grapes. Wild grapes were increasingly seen as weeds rather than food sources during the 1950s, as suburban landscaping emphasized control and tidiness over productivity. These vigorous vines were considered too aggressive for well-manicured yards, and their tendency to climb trees and spread rapidly made them unwelcome in neighborhoods where every plant was expected to stay in its designated space. Herbicides made it easy to eliminate them from fence lines and woodland edges. The grapes themselves were valuable for jams, jellies, and juice, with an intense flavor that commercial grapes couldn't match. Many varieties were perfectly suited to local climates and required no care or chemical inputs. But the 1950s aesthetic of controlled landscapes had no room for plants that grew where they wanted rather than where humans planned, leading to the systematic removal of these productive native vines. Number 11. Crab apples. Crab apples were relegated to purely ornamental status during the 1950s as Americans developed a preference for large, sweet apples and forgot that small tart crab apples were excellent for cooking and preserving. Nurseries began selecting crabapple varieties solely for flower display and disease resistance, often choosing sterile varieties that produced no fruit at all. The connection between crabapples and food was deliberately severed in favor of ornamental value. Traditional crab apples make superior jellies, preserves, and cider with a complex tartness that adds depth to recipes. They're also incredibly hardy and productive, often bearing fruit when full-size apple trees fail due to late frosts or poor weather. But the 1950s emphasis on convenience foods and large sweet fruits meant that crab apples were seen as inferior rather than different, leading to their exile from the edible landscape. Number 10. Choke cherries. Choke cherries were discouraged from home cultivation during the 1950s due to safety concerns about their astringent taste and the presence of compounds in the pits that could be harmful if consumed in large quantities. The name itself, choke cherry, contributed to fears that the fruit was dangerous, even though it had been safely consumed by Native Americans and settlers for centuries when properly prepared. The fruit is intensely astringent when raw but transforms into excellent jellies, syrups, and wines when cooked with sugar. Choke cherries are also incredibly hardy and productive, thriving in harsh climates where other fruits fail. But the 1950s preference for mild, sweet flavors and the general fear of anything that required special knowledge to prepare safely led to the abandonment of this traditional food source. Number 9. Huckleberries. Huckleberries were gradually eliminated from cultivation as commercial blueberry production expanded in the 1950s, and consumers were taught to prefer the larger, sweeter, more uniform commercial berries. Huckleberries, with their intense flavor and small size, were seen as inferior to blueberries, even though they're actually more flavorful and nutritious. Agricultural research focused entirely on blueberry improvement, leaving huckleberries behind. True huckleberries have a complex, wine-like flavor that's far more intense than blueberries, and they're packed with antioxidants and nutrients. They also grow in areas where blueberries struggle, making them valuable for difficult sites. But the 1950s agricultural focus on standardization and commercial viability meant that unique, flavorful fruits like huckleberries were abandoned in favor of crops that could be mass-produced and shipped nationwide. Number 8. Mayhaws. Mayhaws were discouraged from cultivation outside their native southeast as agricultural focus shifted toward crops that could be grown nationwide rather than regional specialties. These small, tart fruits that ripen in May were perfect for the hot, humid conditions of the Gulf Coast, but they didn't fit the 1950s model of standardized agriculture that could be replicated anywhere in the country. Mayhaw jelly was once a prized delicacy throughout the South, with a unique, tart, sweet flavor that couldn't be replicated by any other fruit. The trees are also incredibly productive and well adapted to wet, difficult sites where other fruits won't grow. But the 1950s push toward national food distribution systems meant that regional specialties like mayhaws were seen as obstacles to efficiency. rather than treasures worth preserving. Number 7. Sand cherries. Sand cherries were eliminated from most home gardens during the 1950s as they were reclassified from fruit plants to erosion control shrubs. These hardy, drought-tolerant plants produce small tart cherries that were once valued for jams and preserves, especially in harsh climates where other fruits couldn't survive. But agricultural extensions began recommending them solely for soil stabilization, ignoring their food value entirely. The cherries are small but intensely flavored, perfect for cooking and preserving, even if they're too tart for fresh eating. Sand cherries are also incredibly hardy, surviving drought, cold, and poor soil that would kill other fruit plants. But the 1950s focus on large, sweet fruits for fresh eating meant that these tough, productive plants were overlooked in favor of more conventional crops that required better growing conditions. Number 6. Autumn olives. Autumn olives were initially promoted in the 1950s for erosion control and wildlife habitat, but they were quickly banned from cultivation when they proved too successful at spreading and began crowding out native plants. These prolific fruit producers were brought from Asia as a conservation tool, but their aggressive growth habit made them environmental threats rather than garden assets. The fruits themselves are nutritious and flavorful, with high levels of lycopene and a tart sweet taste that's excellent for jams and sauces. But autumn olives spread so rapidly and effectively that they began taking over entire ecosystems, leading to their classification as invasive species. The 1950s lesson was that even beneficial plants can become problems when they're too successful in the wrong environment. Number 5. Cornelian cherries. Cornelian cherries were dropped from American cultivation during the 1950s as they were seen as too European and old-fashioned for modern American gardens. These early blooming trees produced tart, vitamin-rich fruits that were prized in Europe for centuries, but they never gained popularity in America, where sweet cherries were preferred. The 1950s emphasis on American-bred varieties led to the abandonment of many European fruit varieties. The fruits are incredibly nutritious, with more vitamin C than oranges, and they ripen at a time when few other fruits are available. Cornelian cherries are also extremely hardy and long-lived, with some trees producing for over 100 years. But their tart flavor and unfamiliar appearance made them seem foreign and undesirable to 1950s American palates that preferred sweet, familiar flavors. Number 4. Medlars. Medlars were abandoned by American gardeners in the 1950s because their unique ripening process, called bletting, seemed too strange and complicated for modern convenience culture. These medieval fruits must be allowed to soften and partially decay before they're edible, a process that takes weeks and results in a brown, mushy fruit that looks spoiled but tastes like spiced applesauce. The flavor of properly blended medlars is extraordinary, sweet, complex, and unlike any other fruit. They were once considered delicacies in Europe and were grown in American gardens through the 1800s, but the 1950s preference for fruits that looked perfect and could be eaten immediately meant that medlars, with their unusual appearance and lengthy preparation process, were seen as too much trouble for too little reward. Number 3. Quinces. Quinces were largely abandoned by American home gardeners in the 1950s as fresh fruit consumption patterns changed and people stopped making the preserves and jellies that quinces were perfect for. These aromatic fruits are too hard and tart to eat fresh, but they transform into golden, fragrant preserves when cooked with sugar. The decline of home food preservation meant that quinces lost their primary purpose. The 1950s shift toward convenience foods and fresh fruit consumption left no place for quinces, which require cooking to be palatable. Their incredible fragrance and unique flavor made them prized for jellies and preserves that could capture their essence. But as fewer families preserved their own food, quinces seemed pointless. The knowledge of how to use quinces was lost along with the trees themselves. Number 2, American chestnuts. American chestnuts weren't banned by choice. They were eliminated by chestnut blight, a fungal disease that wiped out nearly 4 billion trees by the 1950s, effectively ending their role in American agriculture and cuisine. These massive trees had been the backbone of Appalachian economies and a crucial food source for both wildlife and humans, producing sweet, nutritious nuts that were roasted on street corners and ground into flour for bread. The loss of American chestnuts was one of the greatest ecological disasters in American history, eliminating a tree that made up 25% of eastern forests and supported entire communities. The nuts were a major cash crop and food source with a sweet flavor unlike any other nut. By the 1950s, the few surviving trees were so rare that most Americans had never tasted a real American chestnut, and the species existed only in memory and old photographs of giant trees that once dominated the landscape. Number 1, barberries. Barberries were banned across much of America in the 1950s because they served as an alternate host for wheat stem rust, a fungal disease that could devastate grain crops. The federal government launched an aggressive eradication campaign, making it illegal to grow, sell, or transport barberries in wheat-growing regions. Homeowners were required to remove existing bushes, and agricultural agents would destroy any barberries they found. The berries themselves were prized for their intense tartness and high vitamin C content, perfect for jellies, sauces, and traditional Persian cooking. European immigrants had brought barberries to America and cultivated them successfully for generations. But the threat to wheat production was considered too great, and barberries were sacrificed to protect America's grain supply. The ban was so thorough that most Americans today have never seen or tasted these bright red, intensely sour berries that once grew in gardens across the country. These 20 fruits tell the story of how America changed in the 1950s, from a nation that grew diverse, regional foods to one focused on standardized commercial agriculture. Many of these forgotten fruits are making a comeback as gardeners rediscover their unique flavors and hearty nature. Hit that subscribe button and check out our next video about banned vegetables that are returning to American gardens.